Good evening. My name is Emily Towns, and I am Dean of Vanderbilt University Divinity School. On behalf of the Divinity School and the university, welcome to this year's Cole Lecture. This lectureship was established in 1893 by Colonel E.W. Cole of Nashville to bring distinguished lecturers to the campus in, quote, defense and advocacy of the Christian religion, close quote. As we have now turned into the 21st century, we are broadening this once again to include engagement, conversation, and even shared deliberation that Christian traditions might share with other faith traditions. Among the distinguished church leaders and theologians who have delivered the Cole Lectures over the last 128 years are Harry Emerson Fosdick, Paul Tillich, H. Richard Niebuhr, Fred Craddock, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, Albert J. Rabateau, Gustavo Gutierrez, James Cone, Donald Beiswinger, Edward Farley, David Buttrick, Jürgen Moltmann, Peter Gomes, Jim Wallace, James Lawson, Elaine Pagels, Nikki Finney, Daisy Machado, and Gary Dory. This year's co-lecturer is R. Marie Griffith, the John C. Danforth Distinguished Professor in the Humanities at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. She is currently the director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics and the editor of the center's journal, Religion and Politics. Professor Griffith obtained her undergraduate degree at the University of Virginia in political and social thought, and her PhD in the study of religion from Harvard University. Before moving to Washington University in 2011, she served as professor of religion and director of the Women and Gender Studies program at Princeton University, and later as the John A. Barrett Professor of New England Church History at Harvard. She is the author or editor of 6 books, including God's Daughters, Evangelical Women and the Power of Submission, 1997, Born Again Bodies, Flesh and Spirit in American Christianity, 2004, and Moral Combat, How Sex Divided American Christians and Fractured American Politics, 2017. Griffith's research focuses on current issues pertaining to religion and politics, including the changing profile of American evangelicals and ongoing conflicts over gender, sexuality, and marriage. Tonight, her co-lecture is entitled Making the World Open, Confronting Racism, Misogyny, and Xenophobia in the Religions that Have Shaped Us. Following her lecture, we will have a question and answer period. So please post your questions in either the chat or in the Q&A. Welcome, Professor Griffith.
Thank you so much, Dean Towns. That was a lovely introduction, and it's very intimidating to stand in that line of thinkers that you listed. That it's such an honor for me to be here, and I'm so very sorry not to be physically present with all of you in my home state of Tennessee. I grew up in Chattanooga, and my mother is from Springfield, which was then a tiny country town not too far from Nashville. And I was really looking forward to coming home and seeing you all. Instead, I am in St. Louis, and on this Indigenous Peoples Day, I want to start by respectfully acknowledging that I am on the traditional ancestral lands of the Osage Nation. What an honor it was to receive Dean Towns' gracious invitation to deliver the 2021 Cole Lecture. Her initial correspondence arrived in June of 2018, and I accepted immediately. That was 3 years and 4 months ago. And boy, doesn't that actually feel like a lifetime ago to us all. Most were blissfully unaware of the conditions that were already paving the way for a global pandemic that would upend the lives of every human being on Earth. One crucial reason COVID-19 has been so horrifically deadly in the US and elsewhere was our unpreparedness, born of a refusal to learn from the past and support the infrastructure for public health professionals and institutional healthcare workers to be at the ready. Refusing to learn from the past is deadly, and that's precisely what I would like to speak with you all about today. We live in a deeply troubled time. There's no way around that. And the question that I have heard over and over again in settings such as this one, in which the issues of the day are analyzed in a serious way, is simply, what can we do? In my experience, speaking on religion and politics at colleges and universities, religious and civic organizations, and other public gatherings, this is a question haunting untold numbers of us, uniting us in something like desperation, if not despair. What can we do, or some version of that question, is a question that I hear daily, as I know my fellow scholars and teachers and students do too, and doubtless countless others of you from all walks of life. When we ask this question, most of us are not seeking easy answers, so much as pleading aloud for ways to help the world we are living in, to improve the civic and political and religious culture of the United States, if that is our home, and to end the enormous suffering and injustice permeating our society. Whether we focus on religious intolerance, gender inequality, structural racism, regulations on sexuality, our country's broken immigration system, the abuse of authority by political and religious elites, voter suppression, or battles over abortion, and much else, American observers show ourselves to be keenly concerned about the state of the nation. Many of us distraught over what we view as the horrors unleashed, or at least exacerbated, by Donald Trump's presidential administration, both before and during the pandemic. And we're eager to do something constructive to mitigate them. Many of us acutely want, in other words, to make the world better. Making the world better is a lofty goal, though, and projects that seem promising often turn out to be paradoxical. No scene better illustrates the need for caution than one from The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's celebrated dystopian novel. Commander Fred Waterford, who helped establish this totalitarian fundamentalist Christian society based on the ruthless subjugation of women, tries to explain to his captive handmaid why the rules against women are so brutal. And in the televised adaptation of this scene, he defends himself and he says, "We only wanted to make the world better." Better? The handmaid splutters. And coldly, the commander answers, "Better never means better for everyone. It always means worse for some." US history is filled with examples of well-intentioned efforts to make the world better that in retrospect, many judge to have been good only for the few and profoundly destructive to many others. The history of indigenous nations in this country is a looming example that is far too frequently buried below the ground from which non-Native Americans narrate the past. From the outset, we have to acknowledge that the founding of the United States was not simply the product of a romanticized Revolutionary War. The conditions leading up to that war could occur only after long years of settler colonialism became naturalized, part of the ongoing violent process of dispossessing Native inhabitants of their land and destroying untold numbers of them with disease, broken treaties, and war. Settlers no doubt believed they were making the world better for themselves and their kin and kind anyway, but they either did not perceive or did not care about the awful price paid by others for white self-improvement. No thinker has probed these problems more deeply than James Baldwin, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Throughout his published work and public lectures, Baldwin called Americans to account for their long habit of forgetting inconvenient truths about the past. In particular, he called white Americans to account for the hypocrisy of what Baldwin's latest interpreter, Eddie Glaude Jr., simply calls the lie, the myth white people have perpetually insisted upon, that they are innocent and pure of heart and ever kind to others, God-loving Christians all around. The whitewashing of history to strip it from all unpleasantness and unjust abusive violence toward others has created conditions that have worked to make the world better for a selection of the country's inhabitants and worse for many others, far more than some. In a successfully whitewashed history, the past is quickly forgotten, both its beautiful parts and its evils. We Americans, Baldwin warned, are historical amnesiacs, suffering from a type of dementia that leaves white and Black people alike bereft of both past and future. All has been reduced to survival of the fittest in the now, and the nation will not long survive its own atrocities. Force yourselves to witness the consequences of complacent ignorance, he demanded. How will you now guard against history's destruction and your own? The challenge, he wrote over and over again, was attempting to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more, end quote. Only by facing the past as well as the present could a better world and future emerge. But in fact, Baldwin was not content with the aim of making the world better. He called us to do much more than that. We made the world we're living in, he warned, and we have to make it over. Making the world over is a more audacious, challenging, and possibly more foolhardy goal than making it moderately better. But our collective senility has brought us to the brink of what seemed to many of us a near collapse of American institutions, political stability, and societal life. Wait much longer, and it may be too late to rescue the norms and practices that are worth saving, whichever ones they are, much less improve them in piecemeal fashion. But frankly, I see little choice other than to commit what effort we can to making the world over in the sense that Baldwin meant, starting with confronting the hardest truths of our own history. And so tonight I'd like to take you through 3 contentious issues in American public life, all of which have been deeply shaped by white Christianity and particularly evangelicalism: racism, misogyny, and xenophobia, or fear or hatred of foreigners. At the end, I want to try to look forward to address the what can we do question, and I really look forward to engaging with all of you in some discussion at the end of my lecture. So I do hope you'll send in questions and observations that we can discuss. It's my fervent belief and hope that facing these difficult issues in US history is a first step in making our world over. So first, racism. The standard early historical narrative that most white children learn in the United States has traditionally been one of benevolent white people, pilgrims, crossing the ocean from England and enjoying a delicious communal meal with the generous, if primitive, native peoples they encountered there. Their arrival in 1620 is what most Americans have been taught to consider the first real settlement in what would become the United States, thereby overlooking not only the English who came to Jamestown and the other Europeans who came before that, but also the indigenous Americans who had very much already settled much of the land to their liking. Now, most people learn at later stages of education that this glossy image of pilgrims is far from the reality of colonial encounter. Today, high school textbooks in many parts of the country, and still more in college and university history courses, do some work to unmask the heroic legends and to tell truer stories about the violence against indigenous people that enabled European colonists to occupy lands that others had long considered their home. And likewise, some learn about other tough parts of our history, namely the long saga of American slavery, though hazily and many distances removed from its full horrors. But whether we are descended from slaves or from slave owners, still more, whether or not our ancestors were even on these shores during the long era of slavery in the Americas, most of us are more or less ignorant of the on-the-ground facts and details of slavery in their minute particularity, and our ignorance has had pernicious effects. So according to the best estimates scholars have collected from shipping records and assembled into the transatlantic slave trade database, approximately 12.5 million African persons were sent to the New World between 1525 and 1866, the years of the slavery trade. The Middle Passage was so hazardous that roughly 12% of them died aboard ship before reaching the New World. And roughly 10.7 million people did survive the terrible journey to be enslaved in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. And about 450,000 of those native Africans were transported into North America. Infant and child mortality rates in North America were very high because of undernourishment, but still enslaved persons' offspring led to millions more being enslaved here. By the time the nation went to war over slavery in 1861, well over 3 million people were enslaved in the United States. Now, these are straightforward numbers, undisputed by experts, as far as I know, but they were not part of many people's education, not really anyone's education, certainly not white people's education, for well over a century after slavery was abolished in the United States. Now, times have been changing, as I say. Many efforts to tell this story and to tell the fuller truths of our history have appeared over the last 30 years or so, and they've made a difference to countless numbers of American students and readers and Americans generally. This approach has sometimes been called revisionist history because it challenges and revises old assumptions about history with new or rediscovered evidence. It reinterprets the past for the sake of veracity, and sometimes alters observers' assessments of what to celebrate and what to lament. So, for instance, US historians have come to understand that ideologies of racism and racial hierarchy were developed to justify the enslavement of Blacks by whites. These included actual theologies. That is, throughout much of US history, most white Christians have firmly believed that God had designed the racial makeup of the world and that he intentionally made the so-called races unequal. This was part of God's ordered plan. During the centuries of enslavement, white Christians who supported the slavery system mostly took for granted that biblical references to slavery meant that endangering and enslaving Africans was perfectly moral and that it was authorized by God. White Christians interpreted the story of Noah in the book of Genesis to suggest that God had cursed Ham, Noah's son, and all who were begotten by him through the generations. So religion, in short, was a fundamental support structure for racism and enslavement. And according to the theology of segregationism, God had created separate races and he wanted them to stay that way. So knowing that now, Christians of all kinds have to take this history into account while exploring the past. And white Christians in particular need to dispense with the false notion that their religion has somehow been pure from any complicitous role in the fortress of slavery and inequality and white nationalism. Now, it's easy to see how this sort of revisionist history can make some people feel anxious. Learning that political heroes, such as the nation's founding fathers, held views that many today find abhorrent, this is difficult and sometimes even painful. And it can feel quite personal. As Robin DiAngelo puts it when she describes the white fragility that many white people experience around the subject of race, the mere suggestion that being white has meaning often triggers a range of defensive responses, like emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal. Some become so indignant at the messenger that leaders like, at the message that leaders like Thomas Jefferson weren't saints, that they rail against the messenger for ruining something precious to them. That, in fact, is what happened in these decades of revisionist history. A number of white writers with public platforms have claimed to feel personally assaulted by the findings and new interpretations of progressive historians, and they've gone on the attack in return. So there has been an intense resistance to academia's encouragement for expanding the actors visible in history and telling a story that is more than American success and greatness. The critics accuse proponents of African-American history, along with women's history and several others, of competing for victim status, as if the writers want readers to feel sorry for their plight. And they also accuse such proponents of trying to remove white men from history textbooks. But those working to expand the canon are not trying to remove white men from history textbooks, not even heroic white men, not even conservative white men. They are rather trying to tell a fuller, fairer, and more truthful story about our nation's past and the many peoples who, in addition to those men, together made that history. So it's truthfulness the revisionists have long been going for, not a political agenda or some power play against white men. Now I have a few slides, and so I'm going to share my screen here. Everybody, somebody tell me, Shatika, if that's not showing up, otherwise I'll assume that's good. The burden of speaking truthfully about American slavery and its racist legacies has often been carried overwhelmingly by African Americans. African American scholars have been the primary detectives to uncover and illuminate miles upon miles of archival sources that tell us who and what forces shaped the nation's slavery-drenched past and continue to shape our present. As a work of historical scholarship, W.E.B. Du Bois's classic study, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, is a milestone in this tradition. It was published in 1935. It's a revisionist masterpiece, in the words of his biographer. It is also significant for its scathing critique of American history telling on the part of whites. So in the last chapter of this book, Black Reconstruction in America, the last chapter is called The Propaganda of History. And here Du Bois excoriates textbook writers for teaching history students that slavery was constitutional, that the abolitionists were bad, and that African Americans were the only people to achieve emancipation with no effort on their part. Du Bois writes, "One is astonished in the study of history at the recurrence of the ideal that evil must be forgotten, distorted, skimmed over. We must forget that George Washington was a slave owner, or that Thomas Jefferson had mulatto children, or that Alexander Hamilton had black blood, and simply remember the things we regard as creditable and inspiring. The difficulty, of course, with this philosophy is that history loses its value as an incentive and example. It paints perfect men and noble nations, but it does not tell the truth." And again, Du Bois, "Nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all of this, so far as the truth is ascertainable?" Now, since Du Bois wrote those words in 1935, decades of painstaking, path-breaking scholarship have made an enormous impact on the way children and adolescents in many American schools learn about US history, as I know many of us have seen in our own kids' education. But of course, plenty of school systems resist including too much about slavery and racism in their history textbooks and literature classes, too much as they see it. So progress has been very uneven, to say the least. So for instance, research conducted in 2017 by the nonprofit Southern Poverty Law Center that's called Teaching Hard History, excuse me, that's the wrong slide. surveyed American high school seniors, social studies teachers in all grades, 15 state content standards, and 10 widely taught US history textbooks. And researchers discovered the following: that only 8% of high school seniors knew that slavery was the central cause of the Civil War. 2/3 did not know that slavery ended formally because of a constitutional amendment. Teachers showed profound unease around the subject of slavery, even when they said it was important to teach it. And of the 15 sets of state standards that were analyzed, according to the report, none address how the ideology of white supremacy arose to justify the institution of slavery. Most failed to lay out meaningful requirements for learning about slavery, about the lives of millions of enslaved people, or about how their labor was essential to the American economy. And they concluded, we tend to subscribe to a progressive view of American history that can acknowledge flaws only to the extent that they have been addressed and solved. Our vision of growing ever more perfect stands in the way of our need to face the continuing legacy of the past. And this was 2017, decades after the historian George Unwin's observation that British historians included slavery only in its abolition. Well, remembering slavery is crucial for Americans, not merely for the sake of understanding long ago history. Slavery's legacies have endured into our own time. The structural racism that white enslavement of Black people built in America lived on throughout Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the South and the North, upholding obstacles to African Americans trying to work their way up out of the poverty that many were left in after emancipation. White supremacy made racial segregation an almost impenetrable force to dismantle until the Supreme Court's 1954 decision in Brown versus Board of Education. And even then, white Americans have remained and remain today adept at resisting desegregation, both directly and indirectly, and sometimes violently. It shouldn't take the death of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, the ones that hit the news when most don't, to shake white people into recognizing that. So with its pervasive legacy of racism and racial stratification, this history is one of the most urgent historical realities Americans must confront. As a part of our history, we cannot escape and must not shirk. But it's not the only issue Americans have often had difficulty facing. Other topics too provoke unease and dismay. And one of them is our nation's long conflict over women's rights, to which I now turn. Women's equality has been at the center of our culture wars since the early battles over suffrage took place in the 19th century. Gender, in particular, women's full equality with men under the law and women's full autonomy over their bodies, this has been a core concern in virtually all of the major issues dividing us in subsequent years. Analyzing the past to address this issue requires us grappling with a concept that may initially sound overwrought or exaggerated to some listeners. And this is misogyny, or more precisely, the protracted reign of misogyny in American life. This is a book by the philosopher Kate Manne, who has developed the concept quite thoroughly in this book, Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny. And in the book, she critiques the notion that misogyny is an emotional or individual psychological state, or that it is simply hatred of all women purely because they are women. Rather, Mann argues, misogyny is better thought of as a very powerful set of enforcement mechanisms that punish women who go against the rules of patriarchy and reward women who are compliant. So just as there is structure that holds it in place, insisting that women freely provide forms of care and nurture not typically required of men. Misogyny consists of the hostility women face when they refuse to perform their traditional gender roles. In Mann's words, misogyny primarily targets women because they are women in a man's world, i.e., a historically patriarchal one, among other things, rather than because they are women in a man's mind, where that man is a misogynist. It is the law enforcement branch of the patriarchal order, which has the overall function of policing and enforcing its governing ideology. So misogyny presumes a patriarchal ordering in which men essentially rule over women and rely on the care and services of women to meet their needs. At its extreme, it's the world of the Handmaid's Tale, enforced through manipulation and psychological torture, as well as physical violence and murder. But it comes in much subtler forms as well, such as the disproportionate attention still given to men's sports, starting when boys are quite young, or the disproportionate domestic and child-rearing labor performed by full-time working mothers over fathers, even in progressive marriages, we learn, in which both partners value an equal division of labor. And it's visible in the social disapproval visited on women who protest. So these enforcement mechanisms, they're variable. They range from belittling and humiliating to sexualizing or desexualizing particular women, to savagely beating, and much in between. It's an extensive spectrum. In Mann's words, these punishments put women in their place when they seem to have ideas beyond their station, while applauding those women who conform to patriarchal norms, women like loving mothers, attentive wives, loyal secretaries, cool girlfriends, good waitresses, for example. Many, if not most people, probably partake in misogynistic social forces and promulgate them as well, even the most egalitarian women and feminist men among us. It's the air we breathe, in other words. And so it's extremely difficult to escape, however fervently we may wish to do so or assume we have. So I think it's very useful to think about misogyny in this way, so that analyzing it isn't simply to point the finger at all men as culprits and women as helpless victims. Women are casualties of misogyny, but they are perpetrators of it too. Many women, it's been noted, may feel that patriarchy offers them protection, and so they resent those who are seeking to dismantle it, including, often enough, transgender and non-binary persons who reject traditional ideals of gender altogether. So in short, women have participated aggressively in upholding traditional patriarchal structures of authority and obedience. So from Phyllis Schlafly and Beverly LaHaye to Laura Ingraham and Ann Coulter today, anti-feminist women have lambasted feminism and mocked women who have fought for equal pay and equal rights. Some have indulged in so-called slut shaming or sexual scapegoating by accusing other women of gaining power by sleeping their way to the top, as right-wing pundit Tommy Lahren accused Kamala Harris of doing during the Democratic primaries in 2019. Women might mock other women with humiliating sexist slurs, as when Maureen Dowd ruthlessly jeered Monica Lewinsky way back in the day, calling her a ditzy with an immunity from brains, a dingbat, girlish, lovesick, a red-blooded predator, aggressively seeking sex and profit, and too tubby to be in the high school in crowd. That's Maureen Dowd, supposedly feminist, word she used for Monica Lewinsky during the Clinton scandal. Women who don't work outside the home and occupy traditional domestic roles might criticize working women who rely on childcare, and the critical judgments flow in the other direction too. Women might criticize other women's looks or their clothes as not pretty, not stylish, not sexy, too sexy, or any number of other things we can perhaps think of as microaggressions. In these ways, misogyny structures micro and macro level choices that women make every day about how to present themselves in the world, how to behave around men, how to treat women and non-binary people who have made a conscious decision to reject traditional gender norms altogether. So this kind of thinking and behavior is far more pervasive than hatred of women in some general sense. And yet that pervasiveness can make it seem invisible, silent, and nearly impossible to root out. These structures of gender hierarchy have a long and deep religious history, just as racism does. So for instance, Puritan women Puritan conceptions of womanhood in early New England conceived of women as having vile natures, helping to explain why so many more women than men were accused of witchcraft during the Salem episode, why they frequently confessed, and why the accused often implicated other women with allegations of witchcraft. So this presumption of women's greater evil and propensity to sin and tempt others into sin was prominent at that time. It fluctuated at other times. And so at other times in our history, women who best conformed to images of ideal Christian femininity, such as reigned during the Victorian era, shown here, were perceived as more prone to holiness and closer to God. But not until the 20th century did women gain anything even close to equal rights with men. Patriarchal assumptions of gender hierarchy were embedded in the common law that English settlers brought over to America. And you'll recall that for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the doctrine of coverture meant that a married woman's rights were suspended and essentially owned by her husband. She could not own property or enter contracts in her own name. She was forbidden from seeking any education without her husband's permission or earning a salary for herself. If she did earn wages, they had to be turned over to her husband, and so forth and so on. She was essentially not seen as a person apart from her husband. They were considered as one, and the one really meant him. Reforms to coverture began in the 19th century, but these norms continued to uphold gender ideals in very visible ways. And in the meantime, waves of European immigrants coming to America in the 19th and early 20th centuries brought with them customs of strict gender hierarchy as well. So as immigrant writers like Anzia Jezierska have depicted, Orthodox Jewish women in the Lower East Side ghettos were subjected to the brutal rule of their husbands and to the view that spurred that women were less human than men. In one of her lines from the novel Bread Givers, a recently immigrated Orthodox Jewish father says to his daughter, so this is early 20th century, he says, "A woman's highest happiness is to be a man's wife, the mother of a man's children. You're not a person at all." The daughter reflects on his worldview and she says, the prayers of his daughters didn't count because God didn't listen to women. Heaven and the next world were only for men. Women could get into heaven because they were wives and daughters of men. Only if they cooked for the men and washed for the men and didn't nag or curse the men out of their homes. Only if they let the men study the Torah in peace, then maybe they could push themselves into heaven with the men to wait on them there. Similarly, chronicles of immigrant Catholics in the 19th and 20th centuries have shown the pitiless gender hierarchies among Italian and Irish immigrant families, for instance, and the cultivation of women's utter dependence on the husbands who routinely beat them. The heavy expectations making up the definition of a good woman within the home were harsh. Robert Orsi writes, "The good woman was a hard and uncomplaining worker who slaved from morning to night. She rose long before everyone else and was still awake when the last male drifted off to sleep. A good woman was utterly loyal to her husband and children. She would sacrifice everything for them. She overlooked and covered over her husband's faults. She was humble, submissive, obedient, and above all, she was silent." And in other conditions of relative powerlessness and systematic discrimination, African-American women too encountered obstacle after obstacle to equality, even with African-American men. Black women's club and church activity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was a struggle for gender self-determination and self-representation, writes the historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. Women such as the civil rights activist Nannie Helen Burroughs decried women's subservient position in Black Baptist churches and spoke of the righteous discontent that spurred so many of them to press for a more active role and presence there and in the wider society beyond. Now, of course, white racism hindered their participation in the public sphere more than Black sexism did, to be sure. But these women did face strong resistance by Black Baptist men to their quest for women's rights within the denomination. far greater misogynistic forces loomed over them outside the African American community, the feminist scholar Moya Bailey has coined the word misogynoir to describe the intersection of anti-Black racism and misogyny in Black women's lives. So once again, a clear gender hierarchy steeped in religious norms and rules structured their lives, and there were real consequences for those who stepped out of their place. We could keep going on here, of course. But movements for women's rights, from the right to vote to the Equal Rights Amendment to reproductive rights, have emerged and been sustained by women of all classes and backgrounds, and yet they've persistently been met with backlash. Anti-suffragists argued that women's participation in politics would destroy their true nature and threaten civilization, or at least the equality of husbands, or the freedom of husbands. These are a couple of anti-suffrage sort of cartoons with poor husbands whose wives have gone off to vote. And on the left, everybody works but mother. She's a suffragette while he does the laundry and watches the baby. I want to vote, but my wife won't let me. So somehow women's right to vote is usurping that of men. And then on the right, similarly, a suffragist goes out to vote while the husband in his effeminate apron cares for the children in the kitchen. So these are the kinds of, critiques that have sort of been embedded here and part of this history of misogyny that I'm talking about. Critics of the equal rights movement would later argue that women's full equality would lead to sexual debauchery, women's abandonment of their husbands and children, and the demise of marriage. Opponents of the LGBTQ movement and of legal abortion have argued much the same. Women are degraded by same-sex relations or abortion, and their morals are destroyed. This is a rather low view of women's character driving this kind of thinking. Without full oversight by a husband and authority over the wife, a woman would simply devolve into this profoundly immoral, narcissistic figure, devoid of love and concern for others. In the words of the birth control movement leader, Margaret Sanger, the church has always been opposed to the progress of women on the ground that it would lead her to immorality. We ask the church now to reverse its method of keeping women moral by fear and give them a higher morality based on knowledge. And just a couple of other examples here of this is sort of women getting the right to work after World War II, and then being pushed back into these 1950s kind of images of gender hierarchy. These are the kind of 1950s image of this Christian family praying in the kitchen that sort of arose out of this. Advertisements show her it's a woman's world, this Thai advertisement. And here's Phyllis Schlafly getting up to the 1970s and the sort of anti-feminist activists who fought feminism from the late 1960s until their deaths. These are sort of the feminist, opponents also who fought back at them. So this constant battle over women's rights that we see again and again, with the battle over abortion as being right in the center of these. The pro-life advocates have typically, at least that many of the leaders have belonged to churches that won't ordain women to senior leadership, Roman Catholic Church, Southern Baptist Convention, et cetera. And so their support of hierarchical church structures is sort of in plain view. And I think this has been very telling in the eyes of many pro-choice leaders at the same time. So all of these battles have been waged in these different areas, including religion, such as the Southern Baptist Convention that's based right there where you all are in Nashville. After conservative leaders consolidated power at the end of the 1970s and took over the boards of major Southern Baptist institutions like its seminaries and convention leadership, they were emboldened to dogmatize on a wide range of issues, including gender roles. So in 1998, the SBC adopted a declaration for the first time in its history, stating that a wife should submit herself graciously to her husband's leadership and authority. This was completely unprecedented in Baptist history, but there you have it. And these debates, of course, continue to rage on into the early decades of the 21st century. Women fighting for equal rights continue to reap scorn as whiny pests and predators with men as their prey. I think it's just about impossible, if you're thinking of misogyny in these terms, to deny the forces of misogyny that are still driving many segments of American culture. The growing visibility of queer and transgender people has also reaped tremendous backlash, particularly toward non-binary people and notably toward trans women, a reaction that has been termed trans misogyny. The reaction to Caitlyn Jenner, who was assigned male at birth, is a case in point. And this fits right in line with a number of state battles over transgender bathrooms and allowing trans people to use the restrooms of their chosen gender identity rather than their birth sex, in which the opposition's chief argument is that trans women are really men and therefore pose a danger if allowed into women's rooms of molesting girls. So all of this is part of a history, an interwoven history. And if there is a theme structuring that history, it's the wrath visited upon women and others who have, in one way or another, dared to challenge the hierarchical social order, as well as the rage expressed by many who are called to face and deal with this history. In countless ways, women are socialized from infancy into compliance with the social expectations for female personhood, and men are socialized into this as well. And finally, to xenophobia. So fear or hatred of the foreigner is what xenophobia means. This is the root meaning of xenophobia, and this is as deep a part of US history as racism and misogyny. Most Americans today know that there were deep wells of anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment in 19th century America that persisted well into the 20th century. Nativism, the open preference for white native-born Americans over immigrants, long exhibited itself in open prejudice against Irish Catholics, Asians, and Italians, among many others. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to lay out so many of the details here, but I think some visuals will suffice instead. And I just want to say, offer a warning, which might call a trigger warning, that some of these, well, really all of these are offensive images to us today of the way that immigrants were depicted. And I show them entirely for educational purposes in the spirit of confronting the ugliest parts of US history. So some of you will know from your classes and from your own knowledge of history, the way that the Irish in particular, Irish Catholic, were portrayed as, in this case, alligators coming to eat up the children of America, the white Protestant children, in these disturbing, deeply disturbing ways, and to overtake the US public school system, which you see there on the hill, and to overtake the US government, as you see there on the left. The Irish were also portrayed as ape-like, as drunk, as stealing elections. You see these two are representing liquor and running away with the ballot box, defeating the American political system. Here's another that's sort of trying to show the sort of murder of the Democratic Party through Catholic, and in particular Irish Catholic, but also Italian Catholic and other Catholic, sort of scheming and overtaking. And just notice the sort of ape-like, features, particularly on the left. This is a cartoon from the 1890s. And showing the problem solved, the great fear of the period, meaning here the Chinese and the Irish on either end are eating up Uncle Sam, that is America. So they completely consume him. And then the Asian figure consumes the Irish. The problem solved. This actually was not an anti-immigration cartoon. It was an anti-immigration cartoon. And then this one from the 1890s shows all the terrible things that immigrants were thought to bring into the country. If you can see the packs on this sort of immigrant beggar's back and in his arms, Sabbath the desecration, anarchy, intemperance, superstition, and then a big bag of disease in his left hand, and an even bigger bag of poverty in his right. This is a 1903 cartoon that's illustrating European immigrants as rats coming out. So just, really, truly, disgusting sort of images of human beings in these sort of animalistic terms. There have always been those who do not like the changes wrought by immigrants or the changes they fear will be wrought by them. This one is one you see where it says a finer screen is needed because the immigration laws are still allowing so many more people to get in than should be here. And there have always been people who want more restrictions on immigration. There's many reasons for this, but the one that's most cited usually, whether because it is the critics' chief concern or because they know that it's maybe a more widespread concern or more innocent or more effective, is jobs, as seen in this cartoon from 1888. This is sort of the immigrant who's going to take away your jobs. It's a question of labor, they're saying there. And also this one from, I think, around 1920. This flood of undesirable immigrants coming over to take over the jobs from the unemployed already in America. And you fast forward to today, fears have been stoked about so-called caravans of migrants from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala rushing the Mexico-US border. Informed experts on these countries have shown that the people are desperate to escape the corruption, violence, and pervasive crime that have cast misery on their lives there. The alt-right claims that such caravans are funded by George Soros. And so here we have some really very contemporary expressions of these racist, anti-Semitic, and others anti-immigration sentiments. So this is this nativist anti-Semitic cartoon by the libertarian cartoonist Ben Garrison, these are contemporary. The ones I'm about to show you were all, he published these in the Trump administration. And then of course, there's the battle over the wall that wound up bringing about the longest government shutdown in our history. And so here's another one on that particular topic that's suggesting that Mexican and Latin American would-be immigrants were dirty, they want free stuff, and they would wreck the US economy. And of course, these horrible caricatures of Nancy Pelosi and Charles Schumer are the ones letting them in. This Ben Garrison cartoonist has long been a favorite of alt-right provocateurs such as Alex Jones, Mike Cernovich, Milo Yiannopoulos, and others. In another provocative cartoon that I'll show you, Garrison played upon the famous words from The New Colossus, which is, of course, the poem Emma Lazarus wrote in 1883, and which was mounted in bronze on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. Her words are, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the retching refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Garrison's interpretation of US immigration policy, on the other hand, is, "Give me your diseased masses of uneducated, unskilled, poor wretches yearning for free stuff, all eager to vote for us Democrats," right? So just this, just kind of thinking about the comparisons between these types of cartoons and those we just saw from the late 19th and early 20th century, I think is really important. There are many, many more of these, and it's really crucial, I think, to note that Garrison's harsh view is not an outlier. It's representative to a greater or lesser degree of a considerable segment of the US population. And that, of course, does include a considerable segment of white evangelical Christians. Robert Jeffress, who's the pastor of the 14,000 member First Baptist Church in Dallas, and he was a member of Donald Trump's closest religious circle during his administration, He repeatedly defended Trump's restrictive immigration policies. He defended the wall. He defended Trump's shithole countries comment and all things like that. So in this white evangelical world, Jeffress is not an anomaly. The vast majority of this religious cohort apparently likewise support this restrictionist impulse, scoffing at the notion that progressive Christians want to put forward that Jesus himself was a refugee, or calling Democrats immoral for continuing to try to block this president from performing his God-given task of protecting this nation. That was another Jeffress quote. So I think it's instructive to go through these last 100 to 150 years and see how the attitudes of Americans, both ordinary citizens and political leaders, have fluctuated and vacillated over time. How we imagine immigrants, what emotions people feel, what responses these feelings stir up, how people become habituated to care or not to care about people coming here for all kinds of reasons, how Americans make the effort toward empathy and become trained to act toward their would-be neighbors. All of this has critical consequences for our capacity as a nation to receive the stranger and offer refuge to the needy and to the oppressed. So to conclude, I return to our preoccupying question: what can we do? And part of what we can all do daily is practice the values that I think I've tried to talk about throughout this talk in one way, values that we know are critically important for our collective life together, including the values of truthfulness, the value of courage in facing the hardest parts of our history and being willing to do something about them, and the value of empathy, of trying, knowing it is never fully achieved, but trying to model empathy for people unlike ourselves. These are values that run deep in the texts and traditions of Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and many more, including the texts and traditions of secular humanism. For decades, the nation's culture has been battered by forces that directly oppose these values. In politics and in other social arenas, events have been driven not by truthfulness, but by willful deceit, not by courage, but by fearful cowardice, not by empathy, but by indifference to the needs of others. And all of these factors have in countless ways made the world worse for most of us, though they may have made it seem better to some. As James Baldwin said then, so many years ago, we must start by telling as much of the truth as we can bear, but we cannot stop there. Instead, we must then tell a little more and more and more until we realize that the atrocities of history can be faced, and that indeed they must be faced if we are to be changed. This task of bearing the truth is an urgent and fundamental challenge on which other urgent actions to make over our world must stand. Confronting our hatreds and the underlying fears that drive them, white fear of enslaved Africans and their free descendants, American fear of foreign immigrants, general fear of women's freedom and the upending of gender hierarchy, confronting all of these can move us along, at least to some degree. Managing our fears, seeking out the best in our religious and literary and philosophical traditions, we can begin to shape new visions, new ideals for our lives and for the future, new worlds. And then it's up to us to build them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie. Quite a tour de force, a thoughtful tour de force. I find sometimes when looking at the sweep of who we've been and who we are, and to try and balance that with some of the PR we have about ourselves, we tend not to be so thoughtful in wanting to uncover the underside. And so I want to thank you for the way in which your thoughtfulness actually, I think, asks us to have a conversation, and perhaps even beyond the conversation, to actually do something about it. And so I want to thank you for that. I am seeing a couple of things in chat, and one Q&A. So let me begin with the Q&A because that was the one that came in first. The questioner says, is it true that Africans descended from Ham? And then, is Africa a curse?
Well, I'm no expert on on that long a history, but I do not believe it's at all true that Africans are descended from Ham. I think that's safe to say, and I don't understand the question. Is Africa a curse? I'm sorry.
That's all we have. So let's move to the next. A listener says, some heavy stuff. Thank you for sharing. And then also a thank you to you.
Oh.
From someone whom I think you may know on our faculty, Jim Hudnut-Boimler. How would you begin again to convince people that an us and them version of the world is not the truth of what you speak? And then also notes, great presentation.
Oh, well, hi, Jim. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to the other people asking questions and for your kind words. I appreciate that. And to you, Emily, for your extremely kind words. That means a lot to me. Yeah, Jim, I mean, as we know, a lot of Christian thinking over centuries has been premised on this notion of good versus evil. And so us versus them is deeply built into the Christianity that a lot of people practice. Now, there are many Christianities, and that us versus them is not a part of the Christianity that I practice and that many people practice, but it is nonetheless deeply structured. And I don't know how you can persuade people that that's not true if they hold just a deeply theological belief in that. To me, what you can do is sort of try and convince them that maybe what they're thinking of as the us versus them is the wrong us versus them, and because I think many of us do believe in evil, but we believe in different, we see it in different places. And I think if we could, try to overcome that us versus them as being, liberal versus conservative or Republican versus Democrat, all the kinds of versus in our society today, that would be helpful. I mean, I do find the classroom a place where that can happen. If we don't sort ourselves out into all the liberal students take this professor's class and all the conservative students take that student's class, right? So I think there's work to do at the educational level, for sure, for trying to have those conversations in that sort of way. But I don't have a lot of hope for convincing people theologically who are already wedded to that notion of an us versus them, that it doesn't exist. I just think we have to shift the territory on which they imagine it to be true.
Thank you. Another question from another faculty member, Ellen Armour. Do you have examples of successful conversations across these divisive issues?
Examples from, that is the question everyone asks. I think that is something that we need more of, are these, instead of just preaching about it, modeling it. I have definitely seen events, and I think our Center on Religion and Politics, part of our mission is to host events that model that kind of engagement. and so I have definitely witnessed and taken part in events where I think people are talking about hard issues over deep divides. But, the question is, and I think this is probably part of your question, Ellen, is, what good does that do beyond the room that takes place in, or maybe it's live streamed. So, but still only a tiny fraction of people actually see it and may take something for it. So, we definitely need better examples that are going to reach more people of this. And of course, we're all critical of our current media landscape and skeptical of how much we can get out there. So it's troubling. And, I think we need to join forces and say we all need to put together better examples and not just invite the people we agree with to come and have a conversation, but to invite them and some other folks in to have a conversation. The problem is, how far do you go with that? When I took this job and I was told that one of the aims was to bring people across the ideological spectrum together, I had to think about what the limits of that were. And partly, I think the limits have to do, with, I'm not going to say this very well, but, with who's going to be actually respectful and who's going to be a genuine listener of others. And there are a lot of people who aren't really interested in being genuine listeners of people who they disagree with. And so, the subset of people we're talking about is smaller than I wish it were. I wish we had genuine listeners, at a farther reach than perhaps we do. But I think it's a great point that we definitely need, more examples of this. And I'm sure you all, divinity schools, I also think, Emily, you all must model this too, and not only your teaching and education, but programming as well. I think theological schools have an enormous role, a crucial role to play in that, as do other educational institutions. So yeah, I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thanks. There are many questions, so I'm going to try and get to them all before we have to end tonight. Can you say more about courage and reciprocal relationships for ordinary citizens as it relates to misogyny?
Could you say more about courage and reciprocal relationships
for ordinary citizens as it relates to misogyny?
Yeah, well, I was sort of skipping through there a little bit towards the end. And, I think what I have to say about courage, in part, has to do with, just having the courage to speak up, right? And we talk about that a lot. It almost sounds cliche, right? The courage to speak up when you see or hear or witness someone, whether it's a racist comment, a misogynistic comment, having the courage, thinking through it in advance, like what would my reaction be, or trying to think through a set of hypothetical situations, I suppose, and doing that. But, I think that's partly what I mean by courage. And look, this is not some kind of admonishment or criticism of people, as if, it's taken us all a lot of courage to survive the last year and a half and more, and to kind of still be standing and still be hopeful and still be in the classroom as students or professors. But I think in a specific way, I'm calling for the courage to really embody, true equality and being an ally of all of these different groups. So that's really what I mean by that. And reciprocal relationships, I think, I'm not sure of how that connects in with the courage point, but, I think all of this connects in an important way. So thank you.
Okay. Wouldn't the word be the remedy? Symptoms of fear, and fear is not the spirit that God has given us. We must try to test all spirits and fruit to see if they be of God.
Right. Well, and I believe that. I do. But we're also, living in a world where people define those words very differently, and they define their own religious traditions very differently. So, I think I could say that's where I come from, but, that's harder to, at least for me as a scholar, sort of preach that message. But I do appreciate that yeah, for sure, that a lot of that is contained in the text and traditions, as I say, of our religious traditions, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and otherwise, as well as secular humanism.
Is "in God we trust" a true statement, or in the suffering God is, or is the suffering God, no, or in the suffering God is right for us in America?
Could you repeat that, Dean Towns?
Yeah, because they just took it off the screen.
Oh, okay.
Could the person who asked repost and say a little bit more? And when I see it, I will come back to you.
The question is "in God we trust" a true statement, or in the suffering God is right for us in America?
Okay.
Well, I would say personally, I'm something of a critic of the "In God We Trust" as the national motto, because I do think we live in a pluralistic nation, and our religion is not our politics. So, "In God We Trust" is a true statement for those who trust in God. But I think, if the question is about that being kind of the motto of the nation, I would have some problem with that, actually. Thank you.
There have been a few books in recent times explicating some of the points you raised. One is "The Bible Told Them So." The basic thought is that people use the Bible to justify this behavior. The front piece on that book cites Jeremiah in a passage that is not even close to the belief promoted that integration is against God's plan. How then do we in theological education attempt the repairing of this breach in biblical interpretation?
Woo, thanks for that really super easy question to answer. No, that is really, it's deep. And so, these other questions, I mean, it's just, that is such a difficult one, right? Because children, if you're raised in a religious home, children are steeped from birth, really, and certainly from preschool years, into a particular interpretation of the Bible. And for many of us, we took that for granted until we encountered biblical scholarship. I mean, I'll be honest here. I was in graduate school when another Christian told me that you didn't have to interpret the Bible. What was it? Literally or something, because I was raised Southern Baptist, and I was, kind of raised a certain way. And I had expanded a little beyond that. I was questioning all that, but I couldn't believe that, there's a different way of reading the Bible and using the Bible. So, it's kind of, the problem is, for a lot of people, it takes theological education, or maybe they take some religious studies classes in college. A few high schools even have some instruction in religion that kind of, I think, frees people from believing that their way of learning how to interpret the Bible is the only way. But that's just a very, very, difficult question. And I think it's an important one. I'm glad you asked it, because I think that's a crucial nut to crack. And, just it's part of why we do have these divisions, because people genuinely believe Christianity is this, and people genuinely believe Christianity is that. And sometimes it looks almost like two completely different traditions that are warring against each other, and yet they both call themselves Christian. So that's a tough one.
This next question is sort of a companion to the question you just answered. I wonder, as Christian theologians and religious practitioners, how can we deconstruct the theologies that have shaped the different forms of discrimination you have described in your lecture, starting with the very documents that have served as justification for those?
Yeah. Well, that's that's my question too, and I think that's really critical. I mean, it goes back to education, and I mean education in the broadest sense. I don't just mean elementary school education or high school education. I mean, becoming educated ourselves and trying to, convey this knowledge in some way. Because it's true. I think, again, so many of us, I mean, you're raised in a theology, you don't know to question that until you're at least maybe a teenager. And so a lot of these things have just been steeped in people's brains as truth. And so again, like I answered with the last question, I do think, it's an educational mission, and I applaud all of you in the divinity school and theological school world who are doing that work, because I can only imagine that is very difficult work to do. So thank you.
This is great, and thanks for sharing. These conversations are needed. How do we get others to become genuine listeners outside the reach of this conversation?
Yeah, well, I might mention an organization, and I have no connection to it whatsoever, but I've been reading up on it and getting really interested in it. It started out as with the name of Better Angels. They've changed their name recently, and I can never think what they've changed it to. So some of you may.
Braver Angels.
Braver Angels, thank you. I always think they changed the angels, so I'm trying to come up with a new word, but it's the braver. It's the, yeah. So you know that organization too, then, Dean Towns. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so maybe you should speak to it, but what I've heard about it, I thought sound very promising. I don't know what the results have been, but they've just started a group here in St. Louis that a colleague of mine has organized. And it's a group that attempts to get people across, some ideological divide in a room together. Maybe it's on Zoom now with the pandemic, but, somehow together to talk about hard issues. And I think there are ground rules and, just kind of ways of doing that. The problem, of course, is you've got to find the people who want to do that. Right. And so, you might find that you're preaching to the choir when you get people in the room. And I think my colleague has said that's been his toughest hurdle so far. So I don't know, Dean Towns, you may know it a lot better than I do.
No, I think you've adequately described it. And I think there may be a few other people in the Divinity School who are very active with it. I'm not sure. So hopefully, if they are and they're on this lecture, they will weigh in. I have a few more questions. I have. This is from Laurel Schneider, one of our professors here. I have a white evangelical undergraduate student who feels that current work to revise the history of hard issues in Christianity, especially, is demonizing evangelicals and Christianity, and wants advice about how to talk back to that criticism with respect, but still remain proud of her evangelical Christian identity. What would you say to her?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you for that. That just speaks to my heart too, because I teach a lot of those students as well. And I think one thing is there's a lot out there right now. There's a lot of lambasting of white evangelicals since 2016 and the Trump vote and all of that. And all of that, I think, has been, there's been an important reckoning. But I can absolutely understand, I had white evangelicals in my family who are very strong Hillary Clinton supporters and who are, progressive voters on everything, and they don't feel recognized in the critiques of white evangelicalism, even though they know they're true, but they themselves are part of a different congregation, or they themselves just have different political views. The evangelical tradition used to be a lot more politically diverse than it's become. The Southern Baptist Convention used to have the Jimmy Carters, for instance, and others had actually a very sort of active civil rights movement presence in the 1960s before they turned in the fundamentalist direction and stayed that way. So, I think I would urge your student to look at history, because the evangelical tradition is rich and diverse. And there is lots, I think, to be proud of within the evangelical tradition. And the broader evangelical tradition is not just white evangelicals, right? There's a Black evangelical tradition too. There's Latino evangelical tradition. I mean, there's a rich tradition beyond the shorthand of what we usually mean now when we say white evangelicals. And there are lots of books out there, which I'd be happy to send references to, or something that I think would be good. But, she's right that it's become almost I hate to say that, almost lucrative, a big industry, to write a book damning the white evangelicals. And, again, for many good reasons, but I think there's a lot in the history that is still there to be proud of, and as well as to grapple with. So thank you so much for that question.
We'll have 3 more questions and then we'll end the evening. Thank you for this truth. I have found the book Transforming Communities by, I am going to mispronounce, I'm sure, Sanya Rani Jha, to be helpful in these topics. Her hope is to help us do in addition to studying these issues. The subtitle is How People Like You Are Healing Their Neighborhoods. So more of a resource.
Thank you. What was the title of that?
Transforming Communities.
Thank you so much for that resource. I don't know that, and I really appreciate that. Writing it down.
Okay. In this era, or daily confrontations with white supremacy, patriarchy, and dehumanization of the other, why is it that the news media, who have not lost their minds, are not seeking out scholars on religion and theology on these issues rather than political pundits alone? How do we fix this?
Oh, I love that question too. You guys are great. Well, gosh, every scholar of religion I know feels the same. We hear, talk on there. And I do think, religion is one of the topics that the news media just traditionally has been really bad at covering. I mean, they're a lot better now. The print media in places like the New York Times and Washington Post are actually quite good on religion many times. But I think you're really talking more about the kind of visual media, television, and so forth, the internet. And it's really true that, political pundits are out there a lot more than the scholars. But I mean, Eddie Glaude, who I mentioned earlier, I mean, he's now paid by MSNBC, and he's on, lots of things there, and he speaks on religion. Anthea Butler is there out and speaking to religion. So, they're finding certain people. Kristen Kobes-Dumay, I think, has made some appearances here and there. So, there are definitely some folks out there that are getting their attention. And I think if they discover that we actually have useful things to say, and that history is important in understanding our present, maybe there will be more of that. But I'm with you that there ought to be more. So thank you.
Do you believe white liberals in particular are the main problem in upholding racism, sexism, and xenophobia? When there are so many Black authors on racism, some quoted here, including Baldwin, do we need to be supporting white authors like Robin DiAngelo? Just curious, as I don't disagree on white fragility, I do think there are better examples of the concept from Black authors.
I hear your point, and I agree. I think that's very well taken. And I had I like her book, and I know there's been a big backlash against her, and I absolutely agree. So going back to Frantz Fanon, maybe that's who I should have quoted on that concept, or Charles Mills on ignorance, white ignorance. So I am definitely well aware. I mean, I don't think white liberals are the biggest problem always on these things, but I think the problem is they often think that they don't feel racist, and so they must not be racist. And, I think D'Angelo actually tackles that head on in some ways, as do others. So, yeah, I think there's been a lot of white liberal thinking on this issue that has ultimately not been helpful at all and has been harmful in many ways, for sure. So thank you.
I'll just read this. I'm not quite sure. Would love to hear some of the books you just mentioned, possibly sending out about evangelical history. If the attendee's still on the webinar, could you clarify you would love a reading list that we could then send out about evangelical history?
Yeah, if that's the case, I'd be very glad to send you all something. And I assume you'll have a record from the Zoom. Okay, that you'll have people's email addresses or something. I'm not sure, but if not, if that person would just send an email address, and then maybe I can coordinate with your staff, Dean Towns, and we can get a list set out. Thank you for asking for that.
Yes, they are asking for a reading list. Thank you all. And I will end with one last comment. What a great talk.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's coming from the Emily Towns. That means so much to me. So thank you.
You're welcome. But I didn't say it. I was quoting someone here. I mean,
Oh, okay.
I think
Well,
too, but I believe, that came from Laurel Schneider.
oh, well, thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think she's speaking for almost all of us on this webinar. Thank you so much, Marie, for being willing to come and tell the truth.
Thank you so much.
And then invite us into a conversation about it. May you be well and the center continue to thrive. And hopefully we will find other ways to partner with you as time goes by.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's been wonderful for me.
You're welcome. For all those who have been with us tonight, thank you for coming and hanging in there for this lively hour and a half. I wish you well, take good care, and be careful. Have a good night.